Good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Evers, OrthoWorld's Senior Market Analyst. I'm happy to welcome you to this session and introduce our speakers. Welcome to the presentation, How to Harness AI to Make Smarter Device Design Decisions. I'll be moderating our session, and joining me are three panelists with an array of backgrounds and perspectives. Brianna Prindle has played a pivotal role in the growth and success of Restore 3D, including the acquisitions of Xenco Medical and Conformis. As Director of Regulatory Affairs, she's helped the company secure multiple 510(k) clearances, an HDE approval, and various breakthrough device designations. Down at the end, Jason Haider is the founder and CEO of Xenco Medical, leading the company's efforts in developing a breakthrough portfolio of biomimetic implants, regenerative biomaterials, polymer surgical instruments, and software technologies. And then in the middle here, we have Dr. Martin D. Jaere, a key contributor to advancements in medical imaging and computational anatomy. His academic work has led to several scientific publications in orthopedic surgery, image analysis, and patient-specific instruments. In 2021, he joined Axial 3D as clinical applications lead to help build scalable cloud solutions for personalized healthcare. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. All right, we'll have about a 40-minute discussion. I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end for audience questions. But I think I'll just kick it off. Jason, if it's okay, I'll start with you. Just at a high level, how are you using and leveraging AI in your research, development, and manufacture?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. As a company, we actually have 16 different FDA product families. And one of those product families is our biomaterials line. For years, we've been a pure play spine company, but recently we've tried to branch out into other specialties, including orthopedic oncology, foot and ankle, orthopedic traumatology, and we wanted to have biomaterials spearhead that venture. In order to do that, you need to build consensus. So we worked on a simulation platform that's based on something called CompuCell 3D. And what that does is it allows you to create an in silico model of anything that you've done previously. So two of our products have been biomaterials that we did the F3207 study on, which means we used 69 New Zealand white rabbits, 12-week studies. And the funny thing is that's actually based on a 1995 study by Scott Bowden at Emory, but it's something we all use to clear an orthobiologic. So AI came into play because when we tried to build this simulation to see how different kinds of compositions would promote bone growth and to build consensus among this diverse group of stakeholders, we realized that we had the micro CT scans, we had the histology slides, but we weren't quite, as humans, able to identify and quantify where there was bone formation and where there was residual scaffold graft. And that's where we leaned on something called MONAI, which is this robust open source AI platform that really helped as an interpreter. And it's interpreting data and then informing the parameters that we put into our simulation engine. And it's been incredibly effective that way. We've gone through 11 different iterations. And if you think about that, we'll probably do 70 before we bring something to market. But that would have been 11 preclinical animal studies. That would have been 11 times 12 weeks. And so our use of AI, to just close this first question, has been as an interpreter to empower our use of our simulation platform.
Martin, how about you? How are you leveraging AI?
Yeah, so I can tell you a bit how we started. Axial 3D is 10 years old this year. And it was a founder, Daniel Crawford, who started to do clinical models for physicians needing them in the hospitals. The technique then is called segmentation. It's where you have the 2D scan slices you pull out the tissue you need, and you assemble that into a 3D model. But this is difficult to do, and it's hard to do at scale. So we had a need there. So the company then realized that many other companies have the segmentation as a bottleneck, as part of their workflows. So we invested heavily then in machine learning technology and deep neural networks, which is excellent at this task. We specialized then in creating custom models. We have developed more than 215 different custom models for industry or clinicians in order to extract data from scans. And they're all being curated for a clinical need. So we do all our ground truth labeling in-house, and we tune the models then to meet the specifications. In a nutshell, I'm sure we will come back to this more.
And then Brianna, how are you guys using it?
Yeah, so Restore 3D has been one of the original adopters of personalized medicine, and that's the big goal of our company, and the major mission statement has been patient-specific devices and implants unique to the patients that we're treating. So in early stages of patient-specific implants, this was unable to be scaled and unable to be translated to large kind of adoption within clinical practice. And we've been able to really leverage a lot of AI, a lot of continuous learning models that are able to look at what is going on, whether it's like what Martin was talking about from the segmentation process of it. When you're designing a patient-specific implant, you go through segmentation on a case-by-case basis. You go through device design on a case-by-case basis. You go through manufacturing transfer on a case-by-case basis. And we're able to leverage all of these different kind of aspects of automation through AI to be able to do that for each patient and each unique device, to be able to make it a scalable process, have better device delivery, have more consistency within the products that we're delivering, and ultimately have better manufacturing yield because we're having more repeatable ways that we're getting those devices to additive manufacturing for the manufacturing process of those devices. So I think we've ultimately used it as a way to make personalized medicine and patient-specific devices within orthopedics a scalable and hopefully more widespread use and adopted practice in the future.
And then Brianna, maybe if I can stay with you, what types of data are you using to train these systems? And then critically for your role, how do you ensure that they remain in compliance?
Yeah, so data is one of the biggest questions when it comes to AI, particularly in the use of this within implants, because who owns that data? We do leverage a lot of the CT scans that we get from physicians that are submitting their cases to us, but this is diseased anatomy. So it's helpful for us to be able to see what's coming in and be able to use that to correct the deformities for the patients or address what's going into those implants. But ultimately what we felt that we did not have and did not have great data to access was healthy anatomy, to be able to train the models of what those deformities need to be corrected to, what is neutral, what is the best placement for that implant or for the cut. So one of the things that we leveraged as a company was we opened up a clinical study where we collected healthy data from patients. So they came into as kind of off the street employees, friends, family, came into our office and they took CT scans of the different areas of anatomy that we have implants. And we actually had them opt in to have that data be used for us so that we had a huge widespread data set of healthy anatomy to help train these models. And then we ultimately have the diseased anatomy that's coming into our company from the physicians who are choosing to share that patient health data with us. One of the biggest things that comes down to this as far as how you're using that is making sure it's de-identified, making sure it's not able to be traced back to the patient so that as we have this large data set, it is not violating a lot of those HIPAA concerns that come in with that use of that data. So that's kind of how we've leveraged both the diseased anatomy that's helping to inform a lot of these models, and then as well as the healthy anatomy that's going into the design of these implants for both of those. Then as we move into a lot of the manufacturing and the transfer of those device design, we have all of that in-house. So we do a lot of the kind of going through the process, having engineers tag that data, having them go through device design, and then ultimately extracting that to be able to put it into models that's able to create the automation using the day-to-day life that they're going through and try to make that more scalable as we move it into a more repeatable option.
And Jason, can I get your perspective on that?
Absolutely. So with our use case, we're really leveraging all of the animal studies that we'd undergone previously. And so we use the micro CT scans of all of the New Zealand white rabbit models. The nice thing about the data that we're using is that it's all coming from the same kind of critical defect model. And so it creates a very focused and targeted set of data, even though it's across several different studies. The other nice thing is we don't have to worry about de-identifying patient data. The other thing with the histology slides, which was really useful, especially in conjunction with MONAI, was looking at BMP rankle gradients, looking at osteoblasts versus osteoclast ratios. And these were things that to the human eye could be very difficult, even though they had been meticulously annotated for the FDA clearances. Having MONAI plan as a helper in creating more robust annotations and really making much better use of that data has been incredible. The other thing that's been very useful in the kind of data that we're training our model on is predictive outcomes. So all of the animal studies that we had done previously stopped at the 12-week time point. And because we're using this really to foster dialogue and develop our next generation of biomaterials in a way that brings voice to different stakeholders across different specialties, we wanted to also share what the 6-month time point would theoretically look like. And using AI has really helped us create that prediction and then inform our CompuCell 3D model as well. So using those histology slides, using that micro CT data, and also using synthetic data that's been created by MONAI, and using that to inform our CompuCell 3D simulation platform.
And then Martin, what types of data are you using in your work?
Yeah. So we always start with a need, and that is either from the client's need. We have discovered a specific need among them, or we have an in-house need to be able to create models. So we craft our own models, always up towards that, depending on pathology and demographic. We have 3 main sources of data. One is from the client. It can be something specific pathology that they want us to develop models for. It can be through development grants where we can use data accordingly. Or if we don't have then the data in-house, we can also acquire data according to anatomy and pathology. We will then develop, we have our own ML machine learning or the labeling team that will then develop work instructions or specific protocols towards that usage. So we then create our own ground truth labeling, which is then according to our QA/RA needs. And this is also anchored up then in 2 of the FDA certifications we have. Is both we have a LLC under the LLC category, and also the QIH category, where we do medical imaging processing. And of course, we are something else to mention is that we are a cloud native company. So we have then our own platform team that keeps the data private according to HIPAA certification, and also the privacy needs. Yeah, thank you.
And then Martin, I'll stay with you. What tangible specific benefits have you realized since integrating AI, and how are you measuring those benefits?
I think I can start with my own story a bit. So I started out as a junior doctor in hospitals. I wasn't really much friends with technology. So I went into research. I worked with a team at the MSK lab at Imperial doing custom surgery, particularly in orthopedics. And to work in such a close relationship with the surgeons, and you're in theater and working them and thinking creatively about the solutions, you realize how much more you can do as long as you transfer over to 3D thinking in your surgical planning. Of course, we did things entirely manually there. I was there for 8 years, and you can really see that this is something that really would benefit all patients if it only was available to generally available. And that's where now the new technology really kicked off 10 years ago with then when the hardware of the GPUs was able to catch up with academia. So I think the winner here is a patient outcome. Basically, you have this 3D planning accessible for more patients, and I think particularly on the more complex cases with some of our clients are from pediatric cardiology field, where we have developed models to extract the myocardium and the blood flow from these scans, and we can print then. We make physical models then for these physicians, and they can then test the surgery and cut into the models before going into surgery. But then the other, of course, so this has enabled, we bring this also out to our clients within the OEM, for the OEMs, where we can really, where we really notice the bottlenecks that segmentation. You have also other bottlenecks, but let's speak about segmentation at the moment, where we can see if we then apply better automation there with the use of AI, it can increase their cases they go through per day, like their technician, from say 4 or 5 cases per day, and you can increase that by a factor of 5 or 10. So suddenly they can process between 30 and 50 cases per day. So this is, I think, the 2 things I want to highlight.
Brianna, how about it? Restore 3D.
Yeah, so I think this really comes down to kind of what I was talking about earlier about scalability and repeatability of the process. So when we kind of first started in the early days of Restore 3D, everything that went through our process was entirely manual. And what we kind of learned when we were looking back at those early days is that patient-specific implant design, I think, it's more of an art maybe than a science. And it was really hard to scale that process, not just between numbers that you can get through in cases per day, but in how you're doing through training of that, how you're going through kind of specifying what those devices are, what they look like. And AI's helped us create some of these first best guess type implants that's allowing us to have much larger workforces that are able to create very similar implants on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's largely helped with consistency across our process, which is nice because if the same surgeon is getting the same implant over and over again and everyone looks extremely different from what that is kind of being produced out to them, I think that would cause a little bit of concern for a lot of them. So we've really tried to make that be something that's creating this consistent process, this scalable process in the case-by-case implant design aspect. And then the other part of that just comes down to, like Martin was talking about, time and money. It's a lot easier to convince people to adopt patient-specific implants and design on our side when you're able to say that you can get almost as many cases out in a week as you could from a standard manufacturing process. And that's only capable of being completed with a lot of this AI-based automation for scaling those design processes and the manufacturing processes that go into them. So we've been able to see a lot of our transition off of engineer-based design and into more technician-based design with the use of these models so that they have really step-by-step processes that they're following as they're going through this, and hopefully have much more repeatable outcomes on a operator-operator basis when we're using that. So that's kind of the main places is the time, the scalability, and hopefully more widespread adoption of patient-specific.
Thank you. Jason, can you tell us a little bit more about how you're measuring the benefits of AI in your process?
Absolutely. So in our space, it costs roughly $150,000 to do one of these preclinical animal studies. That's a ballpark figure. And for years, we've been tethered to bringing to market a minimally viable product. You just want to meet the predicate or exceed it so that you can have something that your users can implant. And that's because you have a constraint of financial resources and you also have the constraint of time. These studies at a minimum take 12 weeks. So using AI as an interpreter and syncing that with a CompuCell 3D platform, we're able to iterate 70 times as what we're hoping to do. We've done 11 iterations so far, and we're actually shooting for clinical excellence rather than minimal viability. And so if you take 70 iterations of preclinical animal studies, that means you just saved $10.5 million. And if you take 70 iterations of preclinical animal studies and look at it from a time scale perspective, you just saved 17.5 years. And so it's unfathomable to think about the impact this is going to make, not just in the end product, but financially, and even more importantly, in terms of time. And so I think that this next generation biomaterial that we bring to market is by far going to exceed anything we've done before. And it's actually getting sign-off from an incredibly diverse group of stakeholders that we'd never be able to approach before because we wouldn't have data to show them that's backed by AI. And so that's why we're incredibly excited about this.
And Brianna, maybe I could bring it back to you. So could you tell us a little bit about the specific AI technologies that you're using most? And then as you think about expanding your use of AI in the future, how do you select or elect which processes to target with this tool?
So the main thing that we start using at the moment, one thing that Martin uses a lot of auto segmentation, which is basically going through that CT scan to physical model that can be used in the device design development process. And then we go from there where we have first best guess of implant designs for patient-specific implants, where it's spitting out what we're kind of telling it to create as this implant that's best fit based on that CT scan data. And then from there, you also can have the kind of diverging aspect of that, which is sizing selection for the patient based on their CT scan data. So in those cases, we have to go through and we have to kind of mark each of the implants. And hopefully, based on the measurements and the landmarks that are going through, which can be used through AI, you get the first best guess of that size as well. As you move into a lot of that process, the way that we select it is you first have to have a really stable process. You cannot create AI out of something that's not well defined. And that's the biggest thing in our early days of trying to leverage a lot of AI. We learned the hard way is you can't have this willy-nilly kind of concept of what's going on. You have to have a very stable process, a very defined process. Make sure you have a lot of data to back up and to support what it is as far as size selection, device design, what's a true good output of auto segmentation. Once you have that, that's where you can kind of start moving into using that to generate these models to help facilitate the processes that are in place. For selection, we typically try to go with what's either taking the most time or the biggest bottleneck in the process. That's kind of subjective, whether it requires a lot of head count or it requires a huge kind of, it gets stuck here in our hopeful end-to-end of less than 4 weeks from CT scan to implant surgery. The next place we look at is what's causing a lot of pain points or a lot of issues in the process as well. You don't always need to be saving the most time, but if we can get better quality out of the outputs of what's going through that, that's another huge place that we'll focus that on. We use a lot of complaints data, NCR data internally to help generate where those pain points are and a lot of the repeatability of the process to help try to inform what should go in. One of the biggest places we saw this issue was in documentation and not necessarily device design. So we try to leverage a lot of those areas. So speeding up some time, but also trying to help make the steps of the process simpler for those that are involved from an end to end. And then the third biggest kind of decision point is, where do we see our business going in the future? We don't want to invest a lot of resources in that AI process because there's a lot of time and effort that goes into developing this automation and models. We want to put it in a place where we see our business going in the future. So what's going to be our estimated largest product line growth, and really try to put a lot of the resources in that area. As Restore 3D, we do a lot of custom one-off devices where we have not a sustainable product line, but more so physicians coming to us and saying, we have this really unique physiological condition that's going on. We need a very specific implant for that. That's not a great use of our place for these models, because you're always going to need an engineer in the loop on that process since it's not an established process. Let's put it into a lot of the more scalable knee and hip business, where we know that that's always going to be a place that you will see large and widespread growth over the coming years.
Jason, how are you targeting processes for it?
Well, there are a couple different ways. One is we use something called UNet architecture. And what that allows us to do is differentiate between different classes of density. So in some cases, when we were just using our own limitations as humans, we couldn't differentiate between where you actually had new bone formation on some of these micro CTs versus residual scaffold graft. And so these incredibly powerful tools like UNet have really helped in creating this differentiation and iterating it much quicker. In terms of annotating, we were doing it manually when we had our FDA submissions, but we've been very pleasantly surprised with MONAI Plan, which has been actually a great assistive technology as well. And we feel that even as we continue to grow with this initiative and not only build in animal studies, but eventually have all of our surgeon users join a collaborative and upload their actual pre-op and post-op CTs and X-rays using our biomaterial, we'll leverage these technologies like MONAI Plan even with more depth because we've seen how well it's performed. And then just in terms of translation, MONAI, if anyone in here chooses to use it, is compatible with DICOMs, but we found that translating it into a nifty format has actually accelerated the process further. So,
And Martin, what insights can you provide for how you're targeting processes for AI?
Yeah. So our base technology, I think Brianna touches on something here that I didn't mention. Like, the goal here is to get to a place where you can start to quantify anatomy. You're going from a scan into not only the shape, which is the segmentation part, but also the landmarking and the measurements you can get out of that. And that opens up a whole new range of estimations that you can then do with anatomy. For example, estimating implant placements, implant sizing, and basically bring to personalize your devices to a whole other degree. We are using deep neural networks then for our segmentation process. We also have other technologies that we're developing for that, then to add that additional layer of landmarking and also measurements. Now, when that's said, we aren't developing text for text's sake. We need like a need for it. And if the need will be fulfilled then with more traditional algorithms, then we go there. If we see that it can be solved by deep learning, for example, we will choose that. Now, something neither of us have mentioned so far, or I think Brianna maybe touched upon it, is the use of large language models, LLMs. And I think we need to differentiate a bit between what we use for production use and what we use for R&D. Now, we are a AI kind of first technology. We haven't embedded LLMs into our production workflow, but we use it cautiously then in our development. Just want to quote Arthur C. Clarke. He said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And the big LLMs, the technology there is being developed so quickly. So for me, even it seems like magic. And you aren't really sure what the stability of these models and what can tip them off into, for example, hallucinations. I've used this analogy recently. Do you know the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? If I consider asking an LLM is a bit like asking the audience, right? You will get an answer, right? But it depends on how the question, first of all, how the question is formulated, and also what the audience, who is in the audience, and what they've been trained on. So I think that is something we are looking into, but not yet incorporated into our workflows.
Thank you. One more question before we open it up to the audience questions. Jason, I'd like to start with you. At least in your space, what do you think the future of AI holds for your space particularly, in maybe the next 5 to 10 years?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. There are two trajectories that it will most likely inevitably take. Just in terms of animal models, I'm not sure how many in this room, I'm sure many of you actually, are familiar with the NAM subcommittee that the FDA put together. That's the New Alternative Method Subcommittee. And what they're really looking at doing is finding ways and actually putting a challenge out to industry to find ways to build in silico models that could someday supplant these more or less antiquated ways we've been doing testing. I mentioned this earlier, but the fact that the F3207 standard that all orthobiologics companies abide by is based on a 1995 study by Scott Bowden speaks volumes. And so that NAM subcommittee understands, and that's a big statement because government's usually much slower to these things than the private sector, that we need transformative technologies to bring in to the regulation process. And if in silico models become the standard and aren't just used in the way that we're using it as an interpreter, then you can imagine the impact that's going to have on R&D. You're going to have incredibly small design teams, companies that don't need huge budgets because they're going to undertake these massive trials. They can actually iterate quickly, have a good idea that may be a spin out of their lab, and run it through an in silico model, and then have the FDA accept the outcomes of that in silico model and potentially get a clearance. And I think that's going to benefit all of us as end users of these technologies, and we won't be burdened by this inertia. We won't have these companies that are 200 years old dictating what kind of technologies come to market. And then the other trajectory is what we're looking at internally as a company, and that's taking the learnings that we've gleaned from this in silico approach to animal studies and putting the challenge out to our surgeon users and saying, you are using this biomaterial that we have all the data on because we're the original manufacturer and the designer. And if you can share the pre-op information and the post-op information, and we can use MonIPlan and run this through our CompuCell 3D simulator, we're actually going to have insights into how the biology works in sync with our biomaterial. And that's something that's been incredibly interesting for us as a company to learn, is that a lot of our surgeon users can tell you and predict almost exactly how a mechanical product is going to do in a patient. But the place where they get stuck is when you try to ask them how a biomaterial is going to play out. And I think that's where AI is going to play a huge role in actually solving some of these mysteries that have existed for too long. And one place you can look to see that there are a lot of gaps in knowledge is the fact that so many surgeons mix multiple orthobiologics in their procedures because they're not exactly sure which active ingredient is helping that fusion. And we hope that us building this AI advisory board and having them share their pre-op and post-op x-rays, running that through our engine with our biomaterial is going to help gain some insights on that.
Martin, where do you see it going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. No, as I mentioned earlier, we truly believe at that 3D data. It provides better planning, surgical planning, and also patient outcomes. So, and now we can see that the technology is being developed so quickly, and results we are getting from our technology. We believe this will be scalable and ubiquitous in the clinic. So 3D will become the default way then of interpreting scans, basically. We've been speaking about a lot of orthopedics. I mentioned cardiology earlier, but with these models to then target specific tissue, but also specific pathology. This would then be available to all clinicians in the hospital, both for education and planning. So that would be the short answer.
Yeah. Brianna?
I'd like to put the patient and clinical outcomes at the center of this conversation. And I think that a lot of what we can use to leverage AI development is helping the patient have a better implant at the end of the day, in orthopedics especially, and hopefully helping us get innovation to market sooner. I think Jason touched on it quite a bit, that a lot of companies die out at the portion of kind of approaching a hard topic, whether that's something like patient-specific. We acquired Conformis, which was an age-old case study that if you can't figure out how to scale what you're doing, no matter how good your product is that you have, you can't continue to provide it to the market. So ultimately, we need a way to help get things in patients' hands in a more sustainable, repeatable, quicker way as well. And I think using it in a lot of the device development process, in silico trials, being able to use it to leverage the best clinical outcomes early on and be predictive in that is ultimately going to get the best implant into patients at the end of the day, and be able to do it in a more easy and quick manner. I think getting a lot of regulators over the hoop of engaging in this AI and not having it be a really difficult thing to get through and get over the hill when you're trying to get device approvals is ultimately how we will get there. Because right now, a lot of companies look at AI as an option and then they say it's too difficult to approach. Or you go through all of these things, treating in silico trials, going through testing that leverages AI, and then ultimately if it's not accepted, it's no kind of use in the development and the manufacturing life cycle. So really making it be something that's well accepted. And the best way to get there is continuing to use it, continuing to learn with what we've done, and continue to apply that to the future.
All right, I'd love to open the floor to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and our room monitor will bring you a microphone so we can all hear your question.
Probably a question for Brianna. Trying to better understand your regulatory submission approach for these AI applications that you use. One example is, I think you mentioned auto segmentation. What were the, I guess, in back and forth and correspondence with FDA and your approach, what were the most challenging questions to answer? The size of data or the type of evidence you provided? And maybe a follow-up to that, or second question is, process validation versus verification. Is your approach generally to fully validate the outputs of the process, or do you still maintain a level of maybe 100% verification by trained operators at the end of the process to verify the output? Thank you.
Yeah, so regarding the first question, which is kind of what have been the challenging questions in the regulatory process in a lot of these applications, the biggest thing has been establishing acceptance criteria. What is truly acceptable and what's a good outcome in that? We've kind of taken the approach a lot of times, because we go all the way through patient-specific implant design, as a holistic approach, where we look at a side-by-side comparison of what a physician would normally do with standard instrumentation, standard implant, compared to a patient-specific design that went through segmentation, went through device design, all the way to implantation, and then compare the results of those side by side. So that's been our general approach as far as how we get through that. My experience with FDA so far, and we've had 5 submissions that have looked at software like this, is that they're not digging deep in it yet. I think that that goes from our approach, where we've tried to stay in the scope of software in a medical device. So the reviewers that they're bringing in to look at the software are kind of ad hoc consultants for some of it. And all they're looking through is just basically, do you have all of the documentation present? And do we agree with your overall approach and strategy for how it's acceptable? We have not gotten into the world yet of software as a medical device, where I've heard that they will dig into that a whole lot more than maybe we've seen in our overall workflows thus far. And then to go into the second question on verification validation, we are verifying all of our softwares that are being used as a standalone software, where we're looking at something like a dice score for auto segmentation, or we're looking at a acceptable size type outcome on a size selection algorithm. But then we're validating within scope of that entire process, where we're taking it all the way through surgeon cadaver validation to say that that's an acceptable design, I agree with it, and then we're comparing that back to what your typical approach of a standard implant would be. And then as we make changes to the process, a lot of our process verification will do a digital equivalency comparison of steps in the process as we go, to try to look at changes without taking those all the way through cadaver. And that's been our standard approach to date. Has worked, although I will say, no disclaimer here, FDA is ever changing, and you never know what's going to get thrown at us next year or next week even. But to date, that's been our approach.
Who else has a question?
Y'all mentioned having that good definition and architecture set up, right? So where do you start with the AI, or do you start with defining that architecture, and maybe just giving some context on where to start with that kind of process?
My recommendation would be start with defining the process and the architecture that you want to approach. Like I mentioned before, it's really hard to automate and figure out the best place to target if you don't have a well-defined and continuous sustainable process yet. I think that that's honestly the best place to kind of get started, and then go from there and pick a small scope of what it is that you're working on. You're not going to be able to take AI and take the whole entire process. You're going to need to break it off into bite-sized chunks. And that allows you to kind of get your toes wet with a little individual section of it. Start with something relatively easy to define, easy to have that acceptance criteria like I talked about, of what's good and what's bad from an outcome, and then use that to kind of expand as you go on through the rest of the process.
Jason or Martin, anything to add to that?
Absolutely. I think that once you do step into that, you'll be pleasantly surprised by the amount of documentation that's available. And I think that a lot of what's happened in AI, as we know, was born out of the open source community. And because of that, you're going to find thousands of pages of demos and tutorials that will walk your teams through this. And I would recommend, which is how we started with this platform called Monai, which is this ever-evolving, open source, incredibly robust platform that's also going to have a lot of documentation to walk your teams through that onboarding process, no matter what level of technical specificity they're looking for.
We might have time for one more question. Who has it for us? All right, you know what? I'll jump in here. And just briefly, for everyone on the panel, Brianna, maybe starting with you again, what advice do you have for a company or an individual who is just at the very beginning of their AI journey? We sort of just touched on it, but what other advice and guidance would you be able to give to someone at the very cusp of starting to leverage AI?
Within my role, within scope of this, is don't underestimate what it takes to get a model that actually can be used within a regulatory and regulated industry process. I think that there's a lot of AI model development and a lot of great work that comes out of research. And then we learned that it's really hard to take that research and kind of almost start from ground zero with the documentation that you need to put in place. So I think kind of my biggest takeaway and look at that would be, look at what you need for the requirements and overall leveraging it within this regulated industry that we have up front so that you're aware of what needs to go into that as you go. And then spend a lot of time in the sandbox looking through what it is that you can actually use and where that resources can go. And then circle back to the documentation and setting it up within the way that you can. There's a lot of stuff about training data, tuning data, testing data, keeping all of that separate, not using it in the same way that's not always used in the academic setting correctly. And so trying to being aware of leveraging the way that you can kind of play in the sandbox, but at the same time, create models that are able to be translated into use within our regulated industry.
Great. Martin, briefly.
Yeah, I would definitely start with your need, so, and not only apply technology for technology's sake. Whenever we approach companies, we always start at the very beginning. We go through their workflows, we identify the points of improvement, and if then an AI model would be the best answer, that would then be your target to do this. Yeah, and as Brianna said earlier, don't necessarily think that one model can solve everything. But start with a small component and look at that. It's well defined and it's a good place to start.
Jason?
Well, like I mentioned, don't be afraid to leverage the open source community. The other thing that I would say that was interesting for us is don't underestimate how much value there is in being a highly regulated company with a quality management system, because there are so many parallels between software development and AI in having a robust quality system. The rigor, the design controls, the annotation. And if you take some of those learnings that you've had over decades and then go in with an open mind into AI, you're going to realize that the kind of rigor you're going to bring into classifying your data is going to serve you well. And so you may already be along in your AI journey as a company with a quality management system. And I think that's one of the benefits of being in this space.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Thank you all for being here. I think we'll leave it there for now. I'll see you out on the floor. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.